Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about how to beat Chaos Space Marines as the Eldar. And this is going to be a series where I basically talk about how to beat each faction, what our best tools are, and how to kind of play the game against them in the most effective way possible. And this was actually a video series that I started back in 9th edition, but I wanted to revamp it for 10th edition. Now, I was very wary of doing this at the beginning of 10th because of all the balance issues that were surrounding the game at the time, and I really didn't want this video series to just devolve into, take the Wraith Knight against this army, take the Wraith Knight against this army, blah, 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 right? Because there's really no strategy in that, and I would basically be giving you the same advice against every faction. Because there were just so many units in the beginning of the edition that were just super OP and super easy to play with against pretty much any faction in the game that you win against. So things like, Wraith Guard and Wraith Knights and all those D weapons and stuff like that were really oppressive against everybody. So I wanted to wait until those things got nerfed and toned down before I started this video series so that I could actually give you guys good advice against these factions. So having said that, Chaos Space Marines is one of the best factions in 40k at the moment. They were extremely powerful in the beginning of the edition, and a lot of people just overlooked them because the Eldar were so strong. So the Eldar were like at bizarre, bonkers win rates, 68% because of the Wraith Knight, and this really kept Chaos Space Marines down. The units that were really good for Chaos Space Marines were just not good at surviving against the Wraith Knight and other Wraith units. So, Wraith Guard or, again, the Wraith Knight would just absolutely shred these units before they could even cause a problem. But since those things are kind of gone, Wraith Guard are still here, but they're a little bit nerfed. They've been nerfed several times. And of course, the Wraith Knight for most people is now firmly on the shelf. So this matchup can actually pose a lot of problems for Eldar players who used to rely on these tools to beat them. Chaos Space Marines have a lot of damage in both range and melee combat. They have a lot of synergy between their units. They're very tough. They have a lot of tough combinations that can be hard to crack open. And lastly, and probably most importantly, the synergy between their lethal hits or dark packs, where they get the lethal hits or sustained hits, and the copious amounts of rerolls that they get. Yes, that's right. Chaos Space Marines are pretty much the reroll faction this edition. And I know that seems bizarre, and some people, maybe Chaos Space Marine players listening to this might say, oh no, that's impossible. The Eldar are the reroll faction. They have, unparalleled foresight. They get rerolls on every unit. But if you build your Chaos Space Marine army right, with the right support, basically every unit you have is going to have some sort of rerolls. And if they don't, they can pay a command point for a stratagem that gives them full rerolls on both hits and wounds. So, my opinion, Chaos Space Marines are, if not more so, definitely on the same level as Eldar as far as rerolls. And that makes a lot of their units extremely efficient and extremely deadly for the cost. And as you will see, I will go into some of the points costs of the units. Not all of them, but some of them. Their points costs are very efficient at their current state. And it's my opinion that Chaos Space Marines are probably one of the most problematic matchups for the Eldar if played by an experienced player. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right into the matchup and see how the Eldar can match up against Chaos Space Marines. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at in today's video. We're going to be taking a quick look at the Chaos Space Marine army rules, detachment bonuses, and key stratagems. We're also going to be looking at the most common Chaos Space Marine units and their counters, and we're lastly going to be looking at some tips and tricks to beating the Chaos Space Marines. So first up, let's just look at their army rule, which is dark packs. So basically every time a unit shoots, and this includes Overwatch and things like that, out of sequence shooting and so forth, or fights, it may take a leadership test and gain either sustained hits 1 or lethal hits. So this works for both ranged and melee combat. And oftentimes, Chaos Space Marine units are good at both. If it fails, it will take D3 mortal wounds, but with the Chaos icons, which basically every unit has access to, you can reroll that test, and it will very rarely happen. So yes, there is a downside to this, but most Chaos Space Marine units are high leadership 6+, and they get to reroll these kinds of tests because every unit is going to probably have a Chaos icon. So this basically gives the Chaos Space Marine army a lot of versatility in what they can take on. If they need, to deal with hordes, they can easily deal with hordes all across their army because their whole army is going to get sustained hits 1. Or if they need to deal with tougher units, they can just go with the lethal hits. So if you're running a tougher Eldar Wraith list, you're going to have issues. If you're running, a more squishy Eldar, list, more conventional, the units that the Chaos have are going to be able to trade much easier with you because of those sustained hits 1. So even a unit of Chaos Space Marine Legionaries with bolt guns is going to be able to do significant damage to your infantry units. As for their detachment bonus, different devotions proc certain critical effects on a 5+. So the Khorne, basically their effect is in melee. If you choose the lethal hits for your Dark Pact, you get it on a 5+ instead of a 6+. For Tzeentch, it's for shooting, and if you choose lethal hits, you get it on a 5+. For Nurgle, it's shooting, but it's sustained hits that you get on a 5+. And for Slaanesh, it's sustained hits, but in combat. So that's pretty strong, but it's not super strong. And I know what a lot of you are thinking, well, critical hits on a 5+ is amazing. It is true, but you have to have that keyword. So unless you have a model with that keyword in the unit, you're not able to activate that ability. Now, what's really good, though, is Chaos Undivided. And a lot of competitive lists have a lot of units in them that are Chaos Undivided, and here's why. If you use Dark Pact with a Chaos Undivided unit, instead of getting, criticals on a 5+ on, certain type of shooting or combat, you get to reroll hit rolls of 1 instead. So on top of already having the criticals on 6, you're now rerolling your hit rolls of 1, which is really good because it happens every single time you choose to use a Dark Pact, which you will always do. There's really no reason if your unit has a Chaos icon in it not to actually use it. So there may be some fringe cases where you wouldn't want to risk it, like if you have one model left in the unit. But if you have a pretty full strength unit, healthy unit, you're definitely going to use it. And this gives you a lot of rerolls every time you fight or shoot. And again, this is just the first of many examples of all the rerolls that Chaos have access to. So as for the stratagems, there's a few kind of notorious ones that are a little bit strong, to say the least, especially in the current meta. So the first one that you guys will all know, that anybody who's pretty much gone against a Chaos Space Marine player, is Dark Obscuration. So normally it just gives the unit stealth, which is really tame, but it can make a Nurgle unit untargetable by range attacks outside of 12 inches. And this is most commonly used on the Abaddon brick, so basically Abaddon with 10 Terminators. Really expensive unit, but basically immune to range attacks outside of 12 inches, because Abaddon has that, Nurgle keyword. Or Accursed Cultists that are devoted to Nurgle, as they have the Nurgle keyword as well, if you choose to devote them to that god. And Accursed Cultists are a pretty tough, kind of trashy kind of unit that are really good in melee for their cost. We'll talk about those later. They're probably getting a nerf as they're in basically every competitive list as well. So some of you may be asking, well, how do you get around this? How do you destroy a unit that is untargetable by range attacks when Eldar melee is typically so weak, especially when you're comparing it to things like the Abaddon brick or Accursed Cultists? And the answer is, you don't. You don't deal with it. You basically force your opponent to use it, and then you just shoot elsewhere. So my favorite tactic in dealing with the Abaddon brick, and I have dealt with it many, many times. My buddy who plays Chaos Space Marines always brings the Abaddon brick. He's always been an Abaddon enjoyer, but, now in 10th edition, he likes him even more. Simply put, I shoot a Night Spinner at it, I force him to use the Dark Obscuration stratagem, and then I just shoot at something else. Essentially acting as a 1 command point tax for my opponent to have that unit alive on the board. And they're not impossible to kill. They do have a 4+ invul save, but they're toughness 5. They're just like any other Terminators. Really what makes them super hard to kill is this Dark Obscuration stratagem. And of course, having Abaddon with them doesn't hurt. The next stratagem we're going to talk about is Profane Zeal. So this allows the unit to reroll all hit and all wound rolls of 1. Now this is pretty powerful. This is basically just on any Heretic Astartes unit, so any Chaos Space Marine unit that has that keyword can be targeted. So all the good ones, Chosen, Legionaries, stuff like that. However, rerolls of 1s to hit and wound isn't super strong, right? After all, if it's a Chaos Undivided unit, they're already getting 1s anyway. However, the writers of the book foresaw this, and any Chaos Undivided unit that uses a stratagem will just simply reroll all hit and wound rolls. Just all of them. which is insanely good for the cost and makes units extremely efficient. Again, they're already getting sustained hits 1 or lethal hits, so adding rerolls to wound and to hit on top of that is making them extremely deadly, even against targets you may have thought were safe. One good example of this is Wraithguard. Wraithguard are a very tough unit, toughness 7, 2+ save, etc. But if you think they can comfortably survive a charge against a chosen unit because they have a lower strength on their weapons, think again. Because remember, they're getting lethal hits against you and they're rerolling all of their wound and hit rolls. So actually, a unit of 5 chosen can do a considerable amount of damage to an unwary Wraithguard unit in the middle of the field. So you do have to be careful about that. And lastly, you have Infernal Rites. So Infernal Rites is one of those, kind of iffy stratagems. I almost didn't include it, but it is basically just like Armor of Contempt. It reduces your AP against that unit. Now, the only reason I mention this is because it's important to note that Chaos Space Marines also have access to this. So just like Space Marines, if you're planning on going after a unit that's kind of important, maybe they're holding a certain area of the board, and your opponent really needs them to survive, they might actually just pop the 2 command points for this thing. Now, it is a battle tactic stratagem as well. So that means that Chaos Lords can use it for free for 0 command points. So Chaos Lords are typically attached to Legionary or Chosen units, and if it's free, you might as well use it. So do be wary that this will be activated at some point in the game for free. If your opponent is running a Chaos Lord, which, most Chaos Space Marine players will have a Chaos Lord in their army to join their Chosen or to join their Chaos Legionaries, just because, having a free battle tactic stratagem when you have good battle tactic stratagems like this is a good idea. And it can mess up your math hammer a little bit. So if you're, kind of aiming to destroy a unit and you put just enough units within line of sight that average rolls will kill it, this thing will throw it off by a little bit. So do be careful about that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the most common Chaos Space Marine units and their counters. So these are the most common units that I've come across in my games, but you guys may have come across other units. These are the most problematic ones, though, in my opinion. So they are the following. You have the basic Chaos Legionaries, the Chaos Terminators, Obliterators, Forge Fiends, Mauler Fiends, Accursed Cultists with, of course, the Dark Commune, Chosen, and Chaos Bikers. As for the Legionaries, they're the basic troop choice. They're the standard Chaos Space Marine infantry and will typically be geared towards combat. However, they are also good at shooting as well. They tend to fly under the radar also, which allows them to assault and take objectives with extremely cost-efficient anti-infantry damage. They do get their own rerolls to hit against units that are on objectives, which is always good. It means they don't have to pay the extra command points for the stratagem. And typically I've found that shuriken cannons work very well on these guys, just like regular Space Marines. They're going to be geared more towards combat, so they're not going to be hiding a lot. They're going to be wanting to be more aggressive, so that can open them up to shuriken cannon fire on things like Wind Riders or Death Jesters. Death Jesters are also another great way to get rid of them. Most of all because Death Jesters have devastating wounds and can clean up small squads of Space Marines rather easily. The Dire Avenger's Overwatch is also a great ability against these guys because these guys want to be assaulting objectives and making good trades. Dire Avengers would be a good unit for this. However, the Overwatch of Dire Avengers makes it hard for Legionaries to actually get into combat in the first place. And I've actually found that Dire Avengers are a pretty good counter to these guys in general because not only can you shoot them first and then Overwatch them afterward, but if anything is left that's going to threaten your Dire Avengers and could possibly kill them in combat, you can always Phantasm back behind ruins and stuff like that, denying them the objective. Of course, that means you're not holding the objective as well, but sometimes it's better to save your Dire Avengers from a gruesome fate. Alright, so next up we have the Chaos Terminators. So the Chaos Terminators are very tough. They're usually seen in max units with Abaddon. Now, in and of themselves, they're not super strong if you just look at their stat lines and abilities and stuff like that. However, they're very powerful when you consider their synergies. And they shoot very well. They can all come with combat weapons, which have anti-infantry 4+ and devastating wounds, which is very good. And with Abaddon, you can reroll all of their hits. And this is on top of sustained hits 1 or lethal hits via their dark packs. So they have really good shooting. They have fantastic combat as well, just like regular Terminators. However, it's best to ignore this unit. I know a lot of you may think, well, how do I ignore something that's doing so much damage? If you're playing on a board with a lot of terrain on it, your opponent is probably going to only be able to target 1 or 2 units with this squad, and this squad is going to be a 700-point unit for your opponent. So chances are the rest of the army is going to be pretty sparse, and if you just ignore them, maybe hit them with a Night Spinner to burn the Dark Obscuration, and just from then on, just play around them, right? Skirt them, don't engage with them directly. Eldar are really good at doing that. We're not like other factions that, kind of have to fight enemies head on to take objectives. We can just let the Abaddon squad have their objective in the center of the battlefield and just play the rest of the board. And that is honestly the best way to deal with these guys. Now, if for whatever reason your opponent is not taking them with Abaddon, then they're basically just regular Terminators. They're not any tougher than regular Terminators. They're not like Nurgle Terminators or anything like that. They're not toughness 6. So anything that's effective against toughness 5 3-wound Terminators like Shadow Specters or, kind of those kind of units are going to be effective against Chaos Terminators. However, I still would be wary about engaging these guys directly, as they do have pretty powerful Overwatch with their Dark Packs with sustained hits 1. They can also obviously reroll their hits with certain stratagems, so you do have to be a little bit careful when engaging these guys. Now, this is a unit that is extremely scary for a lot of Eldar players, but it's not as scary as you might initially think once you get the hang of how to actually deal with them. So Obliterators are basically a versatile shooting unit that is effective against most targets. They have an anti-infantry option, they have an anti-mech option, MEQ, Space Marine Killer, and they also have a very effective anti-tank option. However, all of these shooting attacks have a pretty short range of 24 inches, and Obliterators only move 4 inches a turn. Yeah, you can advance with them, but their weapons are not assaults, so they can't advance and shoot in the same turn. And they're also extremely expensive. So hitting them with a Night Spinner can really make it hard for them to get good targets. And in general, even though they have a once per game ability to use indirect fire, they're very expensive for the points cost and they can only use it once a game. So if your opponent chooses to, shoot some Obliterators at some Shadow Specters, for example, you're getting stealth. So your opponent is hitting on a 4+. And yeah, the Shadow Specters might actually die, right? Especially with that stratagem to reroll hits. But the good news is that Shadow Specters are 95 points and Obliterators are 170 for 2. And it's really not even guaranteed that the Obliterators will kill the Shadow Specters. I mean, maybe they'll kill 3 models in the unit. But, again, this is a unit that's 170 points shooting at a unit that's only 95. And, they're not able to kill them completely. However, you do have to eventually deal with the Obliterators. So what can kill them? Well, if you can deny Overwatch or prevent Overwatch from happening, Fire Dragons are pretty good at it, especially if you get into close range. So you basically jump forward, put your Fire Dragons out there. If your opponent has to Overwatch, then, you might lose a couple Fire Dragons, but even 3 Fire Dragons shooting at Obliterators should actually kill both of them on average rolls. Because Obliterators only have a 5+ invulnerable save. They're not like Terminators who have the 4+. So you should hit all of them with your rerolls and stuff like that. You should wound all of them with your rerolls. And that's going to be 3 saves that your opponent's going to have to make. On average, they fail 2 of them, and that's 2 Obliterators dead for the price of a single unit of Fire Dragons. So Fire Dragons do trade very well against these guys. And Obliterators are also really weak in melee combat against tough targets. So things like Wraithlords, for example. Wraithlords will absolutely slaughter these guys in close combat because now the Obliterators are going to need 5s to wound. And even though their weapons have a high strength, they only have damage too. So tougher targets like, again, Wraithlords, or perhaps even Wave Serpents that you throw in and maybe tank shock into them, can do actually a lot of damage and hold them up into combat for several turns. And actually, I have an example of this when I went against my buddy. He always loves taking Obliterators. He at least takes 1 big unit of 4 always. My Wave Serpent was actually able to hold up his unit for several turns before he finally could get away. And this was just because he thought he could take on the Wave Serpent, he had the chance to fall back, and he said, you know what, I don't want to waste the command points, I think I can kill you in this round. Little did he realize the math is just not there for Obliterators to be able to blow through a Wave Serpent in close combat. And yeah, the Wave Serpent actually did kill one, by the way, so that was really funny to see as well. So how do you deal with these guys? Well, Fire Dragons are a very good option. The Falcon with the Pulse Laser, of course, is very good too. And they are weak in melee against tougher targets. So even Wraith Blades, by the way. I know Wraith Blades aren't meta, but if you're taking a unit of Wraith Blades, just small unit of 5 to hold an objective on the flanks are probably where Obliterators are going to be. Wraith Blades can engage these guys and will beat them in close combat. Alright, next up we're talking about the Forge Fiend. So the Forge Fiend is another one where, my buddy who plays always uses 2 of these things. And they are absolutely brutal. They have very powerful shooting with devastating wounds that will mulch pretty much anything outside of toughness 11 or above. They mulch Wraithguard very easily, especially with a Dark Pact, and can cause serious damage against our vehicles. Bright Lances, however, put them down very easily, often for less points. These things are expensive. They're 180 points, and once they kill something, they are left wide open. They're very big models as well, so they're very hard to hide if they're not directly behind obscuring terrain. Fire Dragons and a Falcon will also melt it easily as long as you watch out for that Overwatch. So again, this thing can Overwatch pretty effectively. You have a Dark Pact available to you. You have a lot of attacks, and again, this is something where it could get very, very dicey very quickly. So do be careful when engaging these things. However, I do have a pretty funny story about something that happened with a unit of Fire Dragons that I want to share with you really quick. So I had this turn where my buddy moved up his Forge Fiend, took some shots at a unit of Wraithguard, killed quite a few of them actually. They were on an objective on the side of the board. Then, in my turn, I moved up my Fire Dragons to engage, dumped them out in front of the Forge Fiend. Now, my buddy was like, are you sure you want to do that? Because I'm going to Overwatch them. And I said, yeah, go ahead and Overwatch. So, he Overwatches me and ends up killing 4 of them. He rolls, pretty good on sustained hits and ends up killing 4. Which is, not the greatest for me. However, I had a Fire Pike, and Fire Pikes do D6 damage, plus 3 more if they're within melter range. So I took my 1 Fire Pike and rolled it against his Forge Fiend. I hit, I wounded, and he missed his 5+ invul, and I used the Fate Dice to do 9 damage. Now, the reason I did this was because I wanted to make sure I did enough damage to where my Falcon could actually kill it, without having to worry about, him making his invuls or me failing, too many wound rolls or whatever it was. So then my Falcon shoots. The Bright Lance misses, of course, like always, 2 misses in a row. The Pulse Laser rolls 3 dice, all 3 hit. I got 2 wounds out of it, which was pretty lucky, but it's exactly what I thought would happen. So, my opponent rolls his invul saves and misses 1 of them. I roll 1d6, I get a 4, the Forge Fiend is destroyed. I then use 2 command points to fire and fade my Falcon back behind a rune to safety on the left flank, and my Fire Dragon Exarch just chills there. Now, there's a really funny part to this story as well, because it gets worse for my opponent. My opponent's pretty pissed at this, because he basically only killed 4 Fire Dragons for the cost of his Forge Fiend. And yes, he did also kill some Wraithguard, but altogether it was still less points than his Forge Fiend was worth. So he also had some Obliterators nearby. He already had used his, once per game indirect fire ability on them, so he couldn't use it again. So he moves up into the ruin in the center of the board and targets the Exarch. Because he can't leave that guy alive, right? Now, I just had to laugh at this because I declared Overwatch against his Obliterators who had moved up, and he looked at me like I was crazy for a second. He said, why would you Overwatch that? You only have 1 attack. And I said, yes, but I have Strands of Fate. And he just looked at me for a second. He was like, all right, fine. I'll make my invul save. Watch. I used the Fate Dice of a 6 to hit. I wounded it. And he failed his invul. And I actually killed another Obliterator. Just like that. So, pretty funny overall that Fire Dragons can actually do that much damage. A lot of people bag on Fire Dragons, but they can actually set up some pretty crazy situations. and they trade very effectively against a number of units. So Fire Dragons are a great unit overall. If you're worried about Chaos Space Marines and being able to trade against their, Forge Fiends and Obliterators and things like that, consider taking Fire Dragons and Falcon. They are a very good counter to a lot that Chaos Space Marines have to offer. Alright, so next up is the Mauler Fiend. The Mauler Fiend is the combat version of the Forge Fiend. It's very fast and absolutely brutal in combat. It will basically kill anything short of the Avatar of Cain in 1 to 2 rounds. The Night Spinner, however, does prevent its advance move, which makes it much slower and much more manageable, as normally it can advance and charge, and gets rerolls on both. However, it does ignore the -2 movement. But the Mauler Fiend, just like the Forge Fiend, is still susceptible to Bright Lances and Fire Dragons, who can both burn it down very easily. And actually, Fire Dragons are even better against the Mauler Fiend, because the Mauler Fiend really doesn't have good Overwatch, so you can easily just basically kill it with the Fire Dragons. If you see the Mauler Fiend, anywhere near Fire Dragons and a Falcon, it's basically a free kill. The next unit that you might be going against in your games is the Accursed Cultists with the Dark Commune. So a lot of people complain about this unit, and for good reason. It's a cheap and effective melee unit that can swarm objectives, and is tough enough to survive a solid amount of attacks, and definitely Overwatch. Dark Commune also makes the unit very tough, with a 5+ invulnerable save, and more lethals with rerolls of 1 to hit and wound. Very powerful, and the Dark Commune is a cheap-ish character unit, just 55 points, and makes the unit extremely tough and actually threatening. However, they do die to pretty much any anti-infantry unit, and Rangers in particular, with Ranger long rifles or maybe even Shroud Runners, can take out the Demagogue pretty easily and get rid of the 5+ invulnerable save and the rerolls so that the unit will be easier to take out. So when dealing with this unit, the best way to deal with it is a 1-2 punch. Using Rangers with Illic perhaps to knock out the Demagogue, and then, without the Demagogue, the unit's pretty easy to kill. It only has a 6+ Feel No Pain, which is not the greatest. It is still good, but it's not super good in and of itself. And on top of that, they're also going to lose their ability to reroll hits and wounds. And from there, they are toughness 4. They're more durable than you would expect for their points cost, but they're not super durable. And in general, can be taken out with any kind of anti-infantry firepower. Okay, so moving on to Chosen. So Chosen are a fantastic combat and range unit combined into a cheap package. They only cost 110 points, which is ridiculous. If you look at their stats and their weapons, you will see why I say that. Now, a lot of Chaos Space Marine players might look at me and say, no, Proxy Hammer, that's not true. Chosen are totally balanced. They're 110 points. They come in at 3 wounds apiece versus 2. So they are a bit harder to kill than normal legionaries. They can advance and charge, or advance and fall back and charge altogether. That's their ability. So they're actually very quick. And on top of that, they do have bolt guns, but their accursed melee weapons are very powerful. So they have very powerful close combat, they have decent shooting, they have really fast movement with their advance and charge. And on top of it all, you would think they would pay more for that. That they would have a tax for being able to do both really well, but they don't. They only come in at 110 points, which is only about 25 points more than a unit of Howling Banshees, and Howling Banshees are pretty much complete garbage. So yeah, Chosen are extremely strong for their points, and we'll probably see some sort of nerf come January. However, Dire Avengers do trade extremely well against them, and Shadow Specters are extremely effective with their damage through weapons. So if Chosen do find themselves into, maybe they just killed a unit of Rangers or something like that, you can easily just wipe them off the board, because even though they have 3 wounds, Shadow Specters and Dire Avengers will still kill them quite easily. They don't really have any extra durability aside from their extra wound. But they pretty much will one-shot any kind of Eldar unit that they hit, and they even do really good damage against things like Wraithguard. So do watch out for these guys. And the last unit we have on our list are Chaos Bikers. So Chaos Bikers aren't a particularly fantastic unit by any means. It's not a unit that everybody exclaims as really powerful, but they do perform a really vital role for Chaos Space Marine armies, and that is objective control, especially secondary objectives. So they're a fast flanking unit that performs okay in melee and range. They're decent at melee, they're decent at ranged. They're nothing really to write home about in the damage department, but what the unit is primarily used for is objective play, and it basically has a lesser sky leap called outmaneuver. They have to be within 6 inches of a board edge, but when they do, they go back into strategic reserve at the end of their opponent's movement phase, so just like sky leap essentially. It is a little bit limited, it is obviously worse than sky leap, but it is a way for a typically slower, tougher army to have some mobility. So make sure when you are facing these things, either kill them right away so they can't score secondaries for your opponent, or block them out so that they can't just arrive from strategic reserve in your turn 2 or your turn 3. Shadow Specters trade very well against them, as do most anti-mech units, so even things like Dire Avengers with their lethal hits are pretty good against these guys. Shadow Specters, of course, still destroy them because they are still wounds 3. Shadow Specters have damage 3 weapons. And again, most importantly, the thing you have to watch out for, because they're not great in melee, they're not great at range, they will beat most Eldar units in melee, and they do decent damage at range, but what you really have to watch out for is that outmaneuver, and they will play on the flanks to use it. So the good thing about Chaos Bikers is you know exactly where they're going to be from the beginning of the game, because to use their ability, they have to be within 6 inches of a board edge. So knowing that, and knowing that Eldar typically play on the flanks anyway, is a great bonus, and a reason why Chaos Bikers aren't really on the top of our threat list. But you still want to make sure that they're dead so that your opponent can't score on those secondaries. Alright, so now that we've gone through all the units and talked a little bit about their counters, what are some tips and tricks to beating Chaos Space Marines? So the first tip I'm going to give you guys is definitely ignore the giant Terminator units led by Abaddon. I know it's a tempting target to try to want to kill those, and a lot of newer players will jump to that and be like, strategizing how to kill it and stuff like that. But the truth is, the Eldar really don't have a great way of killing those things, either in combat or at range. So just don't. There's no cost-effective way to do it, so you might as well not. However, we do have one of the best control models in the game via the Night Spinner, so you can definitely use that to tax your opponent into using Dark Obscuration and just play around them for the rest of the game. And yeah, they're going to score on primary points on one objective, but that's okay. Your opponent paid 700 points to be able to do that and is going to have to continuously pay command points to make that continually happen. So just let them have it and play the rest of the board. Also, don't discount heroically intervening an Autarch Wayleaper. And a lot of players usually hide their Autarch Wayleaper in the back and just use it to farm command points, but against Chaos Space Marines, they're going to be assaulting you fairly often with things like Legionaries and Chosen. The Autarch Wayleaper with a Banshee Mask and a Starglaive actually does quite well against Legionaries specifically, and does okay against Chaos Chosen as well. So if your opponent wants to charge into something nearby, maybe to tie it up or to take an objective from you, you can heroically intervene with the Autarch, cut down a few models, usually 3 or 4 models if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, you probably just get 3. And with the 2 Chosen that are left, they're oftentimes not going to have the attacks necessary to be able to kill both the infantry unit and the Autarch, which will mean that you will have that objective secured. And then when it comes to your turn, your Autarch can finish the job. Also, prioritize destroying their mobility and protection for their infantry units like their Legionaries and Chosen. They will be bringing Rhinos. So here's the thing about Chosen, is that they're pretty weak to shooting. So are the Legionaries, right? They're just as squishy as regular Marines. So your opponent will prioritize taking Rhinos to protect them. Make it a priority to kill the Rhinos so that the infantry inside is not only slower, but is more vulnerable to range attacks. And it also makes it a hell of a lot easier for units like Dire Avengers to be able to control the midboard against the Chosen and the Legionaries that will no doubt come after them. And also, not to mention, if you do have Night Spinners in your army, which, most players, if they're playing competitively, probably have at least 2. Even if you only have 1, those are still really good against those types of units. And also, I can't stress this enough, precision weapons are very useful against characters like the Dark Commune and occasionally cheap Chaos Lords that your opponents will be bringing. Rangers with Illic make quick work of both of them. And by the way, Illic is very good at killing Chaos Lords, so if you have a unit of 5 Rangers with Illic, there's good chances that you maybe won't kill the Chaos Lord, but you'll do some significant damage to it, and maybe scare your opponent enough into not wanting to reveal them. And even though Chaos Lords are on the cheaper side at 75 points, they're not so cheap that your opponent is just going to want to throw them away. Night Spinners also currently work wonders against a variety of their most powerful units, preventing advancing, slowing them down, and providing good indirect fire to counter units like Obliterators. And again, Obliterators, they're very tough and everything, but Night Spinners on average can probably take out a unit of Obliterators if you have a couple of them. And I can say from personal experience, I've taken out 2 of them with 2 Night Spinners fairly easily because of devastating wounds. And again, if the Obliterators aren't getting their armor save, if they're not getting their invul save, they're pretty easy to kill. And, especially when you have twin linked. So Night Spinners are very good at that as well. Don't be afraid if your opponent has a unit of 2 Obliterators behind some ruins and you have some Night Spinners, don't be afraid to target them right off the bat and kill them. With the twin linked and the devastating wounds, you should be able to do enough damage to, at least kill one of them, if not kill both. Now, one thing I also do want to mention is don't discount good screening units like Rangers. They do an excellent job preventing Chaos Infantry and other units from disrupting your backlines. So Chaos Infantry is notoriously good in close combat. They're very effective. They will get in there. They will do damage to your units. Even your Night Spinners and things like that are not safe. If your opponent gets into your backline with a couple of your chosen units or, a couple of legionary units, you've probably lost the game. And that is just due to the fact that it is very hard to recover from that from an objective standpoint. Yeah, you might be able to kill the chosen and kill the legionaries, but to get back into that game and to get yourself into a good position again might be difficult. So using units like Rangers can really help you out with this. It can basically buy you time so that your units can perform the jobs that they're meant to. Wave Serpents, ironically, can also provide excellent screening and tie up Chaos Infantry in combat for a fairly long time, even without help. So, even against Obliterators, like I told you guys before, I've had a Wave Serpent tie up a unit of Obliterators for several turns. That's just because Chaos Infantry, even though it's very powerful, does sometimes lack that damage against harder targets. So that means that units like Wave Serpents can tie them up in combat for a couple of rounds. Yeah, you won't be able to do it forever because Chaos Infantry, of course, has the Dark Packs and lethal hits, but you will be able to buy yourself time. Now, there is a disclaimer that I want to go ahead and mention really quick because it's probably on everybody's mind. Throughout this video, I did mention the Night Spinner a lot. Now, the Night Spinner is due for a nerf in January. However, it is a huge help in a number of matchups, including Chaos Space Marines. However, depending on how the nerfs fall, it might not be as good in the current matchup. However, screening and disruption units like Rangers and Wave Serpents can still do wonders against fast-moving melee threats, such as the ones that Chaos Space Marines will bring to the battle. And also, Chaos Space Marines are also due for a nerf. A lot of people think they're not going to get nerfed. I talked to my buddy the other week when I played him, and he's confident that Chaos Space Marines, because they're in that Goldilocks zone, quote unquote, that GW spoke of, they're within that, 55% to 45% range, that they're not going to get nerfed. But I was trying to tell him that despite that, there's a number of lists and a number of units within those lists, within a lot of tournaments, that are being abused. And if he doesn't think Chaos Space Marines are going to get some nerfs, then he's being a little bit idealistic. So, will Eldar get nerfed? Absolutely. But Chaos Space Marines are also due for a nerf as well. And I think what we're likely to see Chaos Space Marines have is just a number of points increases, right? Because they're pretty much too efficient right now at what they do. So we're likely to see things like Chosen, things like the Accursed Cultists, and, maybe even units like the Dark Commune get a bit of a points increase. And they might do more, they might change how Dark Obscuration works. They might, kind of limit the squad size to Terminator units so that they're not as big of Death Star and stuff like that. But for the most part, I can pretty much see the most things staying the same, just getting a number of points increases across their most competitive units. So in conclusion, Chaos Space Marines are a tough army to go up against. Not only do they have great shooting, but they also have very powerful and durable close combat. They also come with a few tricks that can throw the unwary player for a loop. So if you haven't gone against Chaos Space Marines before, or you're really struggling against them, they do have some tricks that can really make a bad situation even worse. To beat them, you do need to focus on spacing and making good trades. That's key, as well as knowing what to focus down and what to leave alone. Again, those big Terminator blobs, ignore them. Absolutely ignore them. You're never going to be able to kill it, and the amount of effort it's going to take to kill it and the amount of units you're going to lose is going to guarantee that you lose the game. You definitely want to play on the flanks of the battlefield because that's where their most important units, their key damage dealers, are going to be. Their Forge Fiends, their Obliterators are going to want to sneak around the flanks so that they can hit you hard in your deployment zone. And essentially make sure that they can collapse in on you and break you. So make sure that you are controlling the sides of the board. Make sure that you are ignoring the big units of Terminators that the Chaos Space Marine player throws in the middle of the board with Abaddon. And focus on destroying your opponent's mobility. Because if your opponent doesn't have mobility, a lot of their units are fairly easy to kill. You know, Chosen are really good, but they're fairly easy to kill. And we have a lot of units that can kill them fairly effectively. Same goes for a lot of their other infantry, right? Obliterators are very powerful, but they don't trade well against certain units, and they have a limited range, so use that to your advantage. Especially with units like Shadow Specters that you can bait the Obliterators into, because, you know, a good opponent will see Shadow Specters and know they'll have to deal with them, and their Obliterators are probably going to be their best shot at that. But it's going to be hard to get to them, right? So dangle the bait in front of them and just watch as your opponent struggles to actually get it. But that also means you do have to pay attention to ranges, you know the threat ranges of your opponents. If your opponent has a 24-inch threat range with the Obliterators plus their movement, if you hit them with a Night Spinner, they have a 22-inch threat range. So make sure you're out of that 22 inches when you finish your 6-inch move after you fire with those Shadow Specters. And in general, you want to make sure that if your opponent does have a lot of Obliterators, you know, I have seen opponents bring 2 units of 4 of them before. If your opponent does have a lot of those units, make sure that you pick one to kill and maybe just kind of make sure the other one is out of your range until you decide or, you know, have the ability to kill them. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. If you guys have any tips against Chaos Space Marines, please leave them below in the comments. I'd love to hear your comments and feedback. And thank you so much once again to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year that this channel's been on YouTube. Your help has greatly been appreciated and it's helped the channel improve significantly. If you do want to become a Patreon member and help support the channel, I have free trials activated, and a free trial will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is growing at a significant rate, and we'd love to have more people join our Discord. I will leave the link for that in the description. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to pick up some Eldar-inspired apparel at my channel store page, or you want to pick up some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon through the affiliate link below, that would also be greatly appreciated, and you can find those in the description. All right, everybody, thanks for watching this video, and this is going to be part of a series. If you guys want to see more videos like this against certain opponents, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.